I can think of no one who inspires me more to keep doing what I do, and maybe you too. But she's a courageous woman, and she does follow her dream. And she's head of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. She's been to Afghanistan many times. She's been to Iraq. She's been wherever we are causing trouble around the world and creating tragedy. That's the only way I can say it. And so I'm so pleased to welcome back. She was here 3 years ago. I want to welcome Kathy Kelly.
Thank you. Well, it's very good to be here. Thank you, Bill, for gathering us. Thank you, all of you, for coming, for being such true and faithful people over your lives. It certainly is one of the greatest ways to get wind in our sails, I think, to recognize the goodness present in this room. There's a novel that made a great difference in my life when I was young and very impressionable. It still should make a difference in my life. Andrei Schwarzbart's novel, The Last of the Just, in which he traces the ways in which, in his story, young Ernie's family had been subjected to persecutions. And it leads to an ending in which the very mystical story that was presented by Jewish people of a group of 34 people who may not even know who they are themselves, are the reason that ultimate destruction is held off, because of these 34 righteous and just people who may not even know who they are. And so as I think about all of the many activities, the many campaigns that you've sustained throughout your years as Veterans for Peace, I wonder if we aren't in some ways part of something much bigger, something we can't even understand ourselves, which does prevent the even greater destructions that might be possible. I've been myself wondering how to sort of find a way in between, a very terrible conundrum, really, that we don't want to rehash the traumas that are sustained by people who have been in war zones and who may have themselves done some terrible things. I'm thinking of the people on college campuses who apparently are doing 22 push-ups to represent the 22 people who every day as combat veterans commit suicide. And yet we have to tell the truth about the realities of our wars. And so today's theme is so very, very important as we recognize that the 3 to 4, on a conservative estimate, the $3 to $4 trillion spent on our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan since the inception of the global war on terror would be enough to fund the global investments in turning toward renewable energies between now and 2030 that could reverse the trends of global warming. The cost of war in terms of what it's taken away from our ability to solve our most basic problems with regard to climate change and global warming, how we've squandered our resources. But I think perhaps more so than the facts of what the number crunchers deliver to us, which are very, very important, perhaps sometimes it's the stories that can sometimes touch our hearts and help us to imagine change. And so I'm thinking very much about the likelihood that the Islamic State will be used in a sense to market yet another wave of United States warfare in Iraq. And I myself am without question that the United States helped to create the Islamic State because of the terrible, terrible concatenation of horrific events that the United States waged in constant warfare against Iraq. But I think I want to think with you together about a time when 4 people, one of them a close friend of mine, Jim Loney, another who is Canadian and who is part of the Catholic Worker and joined the Christian Peacemaker team, and Tom Fox, a Quaker who was a former Marine, who was a musician, who loved marching with the Marine Marching Band. and a man from England, Norman Kember, and then Harmeet Singh, who was from, grew up as a Sikh, but lived in Australia. These 4 people were part of a Christian peacemaker team group that remained in Iraq, continued to send delegations over to Iraq long beyond the time when it was, I suppose, prudent to do so, according to, maybe you'd say, common sense. Many NGOs were even angry with the Christian peacemaker team, saying, you've got to pull out of Iraq. It's, the level of danger is simply too high. But the Christian peacemaker team stayed, and one of the reasons the Abu Ghraib scandal was ever uncovered was because of the Christian peacemaker teams assiduously assembling a database in the most impossible of circumstances that would tell who was in which prison and how their loved ones might be able to get in touch with them. And so Seymour Hersh had appealed to that database, and that's part of the reason that we ever learned about the abuses of Abu Ghraib. So the Christian peacemaker team continued to function inside of Iraq, and 4 people were taken hostage. And Jim Loney's account of that hostage-taking is a searing and a challenging account, and I encourage us all to read it. The title that he gave to his account was Captivity. But I've spoken with Jim a lot about what happened during his time of being a hostage for 118 days, during a time when Tom Fox was taken away from them and they didn't know what happened to him until the other 3 were released, and it was then that they learned that he had been killed and his body was found on a garbage dump. He says now that he wished that he hadn't named the book Captivity. He wished he'd named the book When You Are Free, I Will Be Free. So let me explain that a little bit further. The Christian peacemaker team men who were held hostage had actually at one point discovered the key to their own shackles. And so at night, when they were shackled together, after their guard was gone, they'd pull out the key, unshackle themselves, and at least be able to get something like a semblance of a night's sleep. They had the key to their own unshackling. And it was so hard for them to decide, should we try to make a run for it? You know, we're unshackled. There's no guard that can stop us. But then if they got outside, where would they be? Where would they go? They didn't know where they were being kept. And so they continued to decide to wait to see if they would be freed. Well, one of their guards was dubbed by them Junior. And Junior was a young man who seemed to be very, very uptight, and he eventually, over the course of the 118 days, told the Christian peacemaker team people that his mother, his father, his brothers and sisters, and his fiancée had all been killed when a United States bomb attacked them as the family was just having their lunch together. And so he had put himself in line to become a suicide bomber, and he made the gestures of pulling the cord, and he was waiting until it was his turn to become a suicide bomber. And Jim felt that, at least in this context, he had a responsibility to try to convince Junior that he should never let his body become a weapon of destruction and killing. And so one day, he just thought he would try it. He said to Junior, "Sit down." And Jim is a very good masseuse. And he began to give, Jim Loney is a very good masseuse. He began to give Junior a massage. And Junior liked it. And the next night, he said, "Mr. Jim, massage." And this became a kind of a ritual. Well, at some point, Junior came in to the people who had now become his friends, even though he was their captor, and he was smiling broadly. And he said, "Me, no suicide bomb, me, Mary." And he has, so it was a good story. Well, when the Christian peacemaker team people, the 3, were released, it was a very, very puzzling circumstance. And one of the Canadian military people said to Jim Loney, "I'm speaking way out of turn, and I'm only going to say this once, I'll never say it again, but a lot of people risked their lives so that you could have this moment of freedom." And Jim was puzzled. He said, well, if there hadn't been a war, we wouldn't have been over here in the first place. But he said this to himself. He didn't say it to the guard who had made that comment. And it's curious because it was a bloodless release. Why was it a bloodless release? Why was there no bloodshed? Because the U.S. military and the Canadian military and various intelligence groups had managed to get the coordinates to learn exactly where the three were being held hostage, and they called in advance on a cell phone, and they said to the captors, you better get out because we're coming in. And so the captors fled, and who did they leave behind but Junior? So Junior was shackled, and Jim and his friends were unshackled. And Jim wishes now that he had named his book, When You Are Free, I Will Be Free, because every time they had asked their captors, do you know anything about when we're going to be released? That was the response. The main captor would say, when you are free, I will be free. And maybe it's got kind of a mystical cast to it, but this is what I believe. When we all unshackle ourselves from the forces of war, then we will find a freedom to be able to free up, to liberate our abilities, our talents, in order to solve the very, very grave problems we do face. But what does this call for now, my friends? We know it. We must deepen our levels of nonviolent resistance to the terrible, terrible prevailing militarism that continues, and catch courage from one another and act together. Maybe it means we go before the judicial branch of governance and we say, yes, we did commit nonviolent civil resistance and take the risk of going to prison. Maybe it means that we undertake some kind of sort of ordeal-oriented event, whether it's a long walk or a long fast. Maybe it means that in some way we find a new means of withdrawing our cooperation, withdrawing our consent. But let us all look constantly for ways to support one another, to catch courage from one another, to recognize that we will be free from war when we find our freedom inextricably bound up with those who are suffering from wars. And this means that we can never, ever allow ourselves to be bamboozled into thinking that by bombing and dismembering and decapitating people who have been so desperate that they would join groups like ISIS, that somehow we're not going to create a far more dangerous such group in the future. It means acknowledging the wrongs that have been done and acknowledging that the United States cannot control the forces that have been unleashed by our violence in the past. We may not like where new borders will be drawn. We may not like those who get the upper hand in these terrible conflicts that are emerging. But our role is to restrain the terrible violence that the United States unleashes through our military-industrial complex and our wars that create so much burden for the poorest and the neediest. When I'm in Afghanistan, my heart could break. When the women who aren't chosen to be among the 60 women that we can fund, 20 Hazara, 20 Tajik, 20 Pashtun, that's as much as the Afghan peace volunteers can manage to bring into a wonderful project wherein those 60 women are enabled to make duvets, and those heavy blankets, those duvets, make the difference between life and death for people in Afghanistan over a cold winter. It's a good project, but of course there's the 61st woman and the 62nd woman. And they come and they want to make the duvets, and they'll kind of sometimes push their way through the door and sit down and thump their breasts and cry. And what can you say to the women who won't go away? They're doing the most enterprising thing they can do to try to feed their children bread, just bread. And so what are we to say to the generals who won't go away? What are we to say? It's okay? We'll go along? We're mesmerized? As Bridget said at a gathering the other night, there's a kind of a ho-hum that sometimes comes over us. But the closer we get, the closer we can be to those who bear the consequences, who bear the burdens of our war, the better our communities will be able to sustain the energy it takes for the long haul. So let us be close to the Afghan peace volunteers. Let us be close as we possibly can, be to people in Iraq who bear the consequences of our war. Let us be close to the veterans who come back for the wars. Tender hearts, tough minds, and withdraw our cooperation with the war makers, envisioning that world where indeed, as was recommended in the Kellogg-Briand Pact, we will abolish war. Thank you.